Good news, bigger isn't always better. In the grand scheme of things, I really enjoy growing my plants to maturity, and in doing so, I found out that sometimes maturity isn't really the thing to aim for. And in today's video, I'm going to show you 8 plants that actually look better juvenile. Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Now, when it comes to growing plants, it's all about the growth journey for me. I'm quite an ambitious person and I love proving to myself that I can grow a plant to its full potential. So I love the journey of growing a small plant into a mature specimen, because ultimately that's a testament to my skill as a plant grower. And it makes the journey exciting. It's constantly about trying to optimize the plant's growth. It's constantly about, getting the leaf to continuously upsize and so on. And if it wasn't for that sort of ambitious nature and that sort of ambitious goal of trying to size up these plants, I don't think I would be as interested in this hobby. And look, most of the time, growing a plant to maturity kind of also works in my favor when it comes to aesthetics. I am going for more of a quality over quantity approach. Yet I want my house to be filled with beautiful plants. So I'd rather have a few large statement pieces and treat them like living artworks in my house than having a shelf full of 100 tiny plants. So overall, I enjoy growing plants to maturity because it makes the journey more exciting. It is very rewarding from a grower's perspective because it's a testament to your skill. And lastly, it kind of works with my aesthetic preference. But there's always exceptions, and I suppose those are the ones I want to show you today. Because when we grow a plant to maturity, it's not just that the plant gets larger. Sometimes plants actually change a lot when they mature. They might change not just in leaf size, but also change in texture, shape, color, and so on. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily end up providing a really aesthetically pleasing end result. I keep saying end result. Keep in mind, with growing plants, there is no such thing as an end result. You can always chop up a mature plant and grow a juvenile version again, and so on, right? Even if you grow in a mature plant, it can at all times revert. It could die back. It could go through shock. It could get infected by pests and so on. So there is no end result. There is no end stage for these plants. But for the sake of today, I suppose let's refer to maturity as the end result. Now, that's good news, because usually growing a plant to maturity is actually like the hard part. Keeping a plant small should be more achievable, especially when growing inside, because maturity is set in the plant's DNA. It's based on the conditions, and these conditions should match the plant's native conditions as closely as possible. Well, that's quite hard to achieve in an indoor setting. So hopefully today's video is encouraging. But enough introduction, let's look at a few plants. Let's talk about this plant over here. This is my crazy rubbish, which is a hybrid that I made. I bought the original plant as a wild crystallinum, which I believe just means that it was pollinated in the wild or in somebody's greenhouse without supervision, let's say, aka we don't really know the second parentage. So let's just call it a crystallinum hybrid. I then used that plant and pollinated with itself to make a whole bunch of seeds. And I've recorded that process in YouTube videos in case you want to find out more. Now, early on in the journey, I separated a few seeds and I grew them separately. And they have matured quite nicely. Now, I don't really just want to talk about that specific hybrid that I made. This is a larger conversation over here about Anthuriums, I would say. I do love when an Anthurium grows quite large leaves, but there are a few disadvantages in growing Anthuriums to maturity. First of all, I mean, it's not that bad in this instance just yet, but they can grow really, really long petioles. The original mother plant I actually had to completely chop up because it grew super long petioles and it grew it in all directions, right? Anthuriums spread very horizontally. So imagine this would have 3 or 4 more of these leaves and they're all growing in different directions. This plant would take up the size of my dining table without really having super nice leaves. This one, oh my god, you're gonna hate me. This was my first Anthurium, and it's probably my most hated at the moment. Look how much it spreads and look how ugly it is, and also look at all of the holes that this newest leaf has gotten. Now this one is living in my attic, like because I don't want to look at it because it's too ugly, and because it lives up there it also gets neglected because I'm hardly up there, only up there to do laundry sometimes. So I'm gonna try something, and I think I'm gonna completely cut this back because I don't know where to put this plant with that spread. With Anthuriums, I personally at least struggle to keep leaves looking really pretty for a really long time. With maturity, we're decreasing the frequency in which plants push out leaves because obviously each leaf takes way more time to create, unfurl, expand and so on. So I personally find that with maturity I have less volume of leaves because I'm more likely to chop off an ugly leaf on a mature plant. With a mature plant you might have 2 or 3 large leaves, whereas with a juvenile plant, because it grows leaves faster, you might be able to hold on to 5, 6, 7 leaves without them looking ugly, if you know what I mean. Now of course could be a reflection of me as a grower, where it's just like, well, maybe I'm not doing the right thing, maybe I'm not giving it the right conditions for these leaves to look beautiful for longer. But ultimately, look, I've been growing Anthuriums for 4 or 5 years in 4 different places, and it's always kind of been a little bit like that. At the latest, when we go into winter, these Anthurium leaves will definitely suffer. So I feel like maturity comes at a trade-off. We are trading volume of leaves for size of leaves, if you know what I mean. And sometimes that works out in our favor, but I think with Anthuriums it doesn't always work out in our favor. The second thing is that when these mature leaves unfurl, they're still teeny tiny as an Anthurium, and then over time, I mean, this leaf when it first came out was about this size, and then over time they'll inflate and become really large. Now over here, for example, you can see this little hole. I honestly don't know what happened, but it could have just been like the tiniest little bruise at the time of first unfurling. But as the leaf then enlarges, this issue becomes worse and worse because there's scar tissue over here that doesn't inflate like the rest of the leaf would. And as a result of that, I find mature leaves to be less likely to be kind of pristine, because the leaf also takes up a larger area, meaning that it has more chances of bumping into something. I don't think I've had a single mature Anthurium leaves that didn't bump into the shelf or the wall or the neighboring leaf and so on. And a little bump can straight away turn into a scar that then becomes a huge issue or deformation as the leaf unfurls. So I find it harder to have a pretty leaf when it's large because there's just so much more surface area for things to go wrong. Does that make sense? Let me show you the pot of all the little Anthuriums. So this is the same pot. They all came from the same set of seeds, but over here I bonsai them by keeping them all in one pot. Now this pot I pretty much had to cut back completely just a few months ago because of a severe thrips infestation, which is besides the point today. But I can maybe put some photos on screen when this looked a little bit lusher prior to pests. And I just think this is so much nicer. It takes up less space. It grows leaves very frequently because I have like what, 20 odd plants in here or so. So even if each plant just grows 1 leaf, then there's 20 new leaves, right? Which means that if some of them are a little bit damaged and so on, it's okay because I can sacrifice those, and or they don't really, like the damage doesn't even show because it kind of gets hidden by the volume. Yet despite the volume, it doesn't take up that much space. This takes up less space than that one big plant because the petioles aren't that long and aren't spreading that far. So overall, with Anthuriums, what I noticed is that sometimes maturity is not really the right thing to aim for. And if you do aim for maturity, you need to be realistic. You probably will have a mature Anthurium that holds on to a few nice looking leaves. It will be really hard, at least in my opinion, to have an Anthurium that matures so you get the size while also getting volume out of it, while also creating a lush plant. Unless you double, triple, quadruple plant it, but then they're competing for light nutrients, space and so on with each other, and then you probably won't even get the full maturity out of it. And when I look online, I do think I'm not the only one. I often, if I see a really nice large Anthurium leaf, it's usually like 1 or 2 leaves on that plant. I've very, very rarely, indoors at least, right? Out in nature might be a different deal. Very rarely seen Anthuriums that have like 5 or 6 large, beautiful leaves. I think the only exception that comes to mind straight away is Queen Anthurium. I think Queen Anthurium definitely looks really, really nice when it's large because it's so nice and elongated. And I feel like with the elongated leaves, it's easier to create somewhat of a compact display with that plant. Whereas specifically the crystallinum, I just feel like spreads so horizontal, takes up a lot of space, and the real estate that these leaves take up isn't really worth it for a long time. Look, I still have a large Anthurium collection, but with that, what I really do is I have a lot of variety in one shelf, and I'm not really aiming for each plant to mature. I'm really just hoping that each plant has 2 or 3 nice looking leaves at any time, so that as a collection, it looks good. But overall, I feel like Anthuriums look better juvenile or maybe in like the teenage stage. And we're going to be faster with the next few examples because a lot of these concepts I just explained, like trade-off between volume of leaves and size of leaves, is going to be a really common thread throughout a lot of these plants. I've done a full video on this plant recently, so if you're a regular viewer of my channel, first of all, thank you. But second of all, you're probably not surprised that this is in here. This is my Philodendron sodiroi, and I've tried to grow this into a juvenile plant. Now, I don't really think I've succeeded in growing a juvenile. I think it's still quite a large plant, but it is still looking nicer than before. Let me show you what it looked like before. Oh, I can't tell you how sick I am of this plant. Is this even in frame? Probably not, huh? And then also let me show you what I kind of was actually aiming for. Now, what I was actually aiming for is something like this. Now, I think in this stage, the plant still looks really good, and I think like actually the first 2 years or so, the plant looked really good. I know I have this one particular photo in mind where I really, really like this plant. I think Philodendron sodiroi has beautiful leaves. It has the perfect heart shape. It has really nice red backs. And when more juvenile, it also has more silver in the leaves, which hopefully is still showing. I don't know, it should be showing over there. As the plant matures, first of all, it loses the silver splotches at the front, or they're becoming less vibrant, let's say, which I suppose is one of the main features you grow this plant for. So in itself, it kind of loses its main feature. It keeps the nice heart-shaped leaves, but it also grows these super, super long petioles that are just really hard to display. Over here, I'm working with a consistent light source coming from the front. That's why all of these petioles really neatly point forward. But imagine you have one of these in each direction, which was the case with my previous setup because I didn't have a consistent light source. It was just such a space commitment, and sometimes when you look at the plant, all you really saw was moss pole because the leaves were just pointing in all directions, just not the direction that I wanted to look at this plant for. So yeah, going forward, I'm definitely aiming for a more juvenile or teenage setup for this plant. I think as a mature plant, you're losing the main feature and you're gaining the hassle of this being an absolute space commitment. So I think frequent chopping to stop the plant from maturing, double planting, kind of bonsaiing the plant because it's competing with other plants in the same pot for light, nutrient and so on, is a good strategy to create a nice lush pole and to prevent maturity. All right, let's talk about the next ones. And I've got 2 examples over here. These are both Syngonium podophyllums. This one is the Albo variegata and this one is the Mojito. I've done a full video on the Mojito, and I'm actually working on a full video about the this one. Now, I originally grew this one up a moss pole, and as it grew up the moss pole, look, it was looking really nice, and I do think that these sort of leaves are actually quite nice. They are still juvenile leaf shape, but large. But eventually they start growing these lobes like this over here, and they can end up having up to 5 lobes actually. I don't have an example in here. I'll ask the internet to help me out. I'll put on a photo over here of what podophyllums look like when they mature. They start growing 3 lobes and then eventually 5. I just think they look best when they keep their arrow shape. I mean, they're also called arrowhead plant for that sort of shape, right? When they're juvenile. So I personally think the juvenile leaf shape just looks so much nicer that I've decided to take it off the moss pole and grow it as a lush pot instead. Over here, for example, there's probably 20 cuttings in here. Look, they're all overwintered outside, so they're not looking super fresh anymore. But what I've done over here is that every time I get a long vine, I chop it up into 5, 6, 7 single node cuttings, propagate it, and put it back into the pot. So instead of growing one plant to maturity, I'm creating a lush pot of juvenile plants. And that is not just to keep the leaf shape, but also to keep the variegation. 2 things. I've noticed that with maturity, the variegation seems to be less dominant in this mojito, but also over time, the variegation fades. So let's say a leaf first comes out, it's kind of nicely variegated. Over the course of the next 6, 7, 8 months, that variegation is going to fade, kind of. It's eventually turning into green on green. Let's have a look at this. These are newish leaves, and you can really still see that distinct mojito variegation. This leaf is a little bit older, and you can see that the variegation is now much more faded. Which means that if I have one long vine, I have one growth point, and that one growth point is going to produce one nicely variegated leaf at a time, whereas all the other leaves are slowly going to fade into a more green on green. If I chop that vine into 8 pieces, and now I have 8 plants growing, I have 8 plants growing a nicely newly variegated leaf. That will then fade over time, but I have 8 times the amount of new growth at any given time rather than just 1. You know what I mean? So by consistently cutting the plant, I'm consistently producing new growth, which keeps the variegation alive, let's say, or keeps the variegation looking very variegated. And because of the frequent chopping, I'm also stopping the plant from maturing and changing leaf size. The other strategy in not making it mature is growing it against its natural growth pattern. Naturally, they would like to grow up trees, and as they grow up trees, they mature and grow larger leaves and then develop that different leaf shape. If you don't grow it as a climber, but rather you grow it, as a clumpy display like that, the plant is less likely to mature. And it's also somewhat less effort, right? I have both of them just in my garden year round, and they don't mind Sydney's temperatures year round. So very low effort setup apart from the continuous propagation efforts, but that also means that I always have lots and lots of cuttings I can share and give to friends. So everybody gets Syngoniums. Philodendron plowmanii. Actually such a stunning plant, and for a long time I was really upset with this plant. I used to grow this to maturity. I'm gonna cut all of these existing leaves off. They are pissing me off so much. Oh, nice. This is better than therapy. And it just ended up having super long petioles, like super long. They kind of just flopped around everywhere. On top of that, it's a crawler, so it already takes up a lot of horizontal space naturally. And then these long petioles going in all directions really made it another level of a space commitment. And with maturity, it yet again loses these silver markings. Can you see them over here? They're still quite nice. Can even see it with this leaf that's a little more mature. It's already lost a lot of the silver compared to these smaller ones, or like these really small ones down here have a lot more silver. Now this plant also has super cute pinkish backsides, and these ruffled petioles. So overall, oh hello darling. So overall this plant has a lot of really beautiful features that I enjoy. And I don't think these features are getting any nicer with maturity. It keeps the ruffles, it keeps the pink back, but the silver at the front disappears. And these leaves eventually become so big that they don't have this beautiful shape anymore, and they don't have this like, they start kind of looking like a wrinkled lettuce almost, right? Like, I don't know how to explain, I don't know how to really explain that properly, but it's almost like the leaf is so large, it doesn't have that much structure anymore to be like this beautiful, like, perfect heart. Instead, it's like a little wavy and like, plus with the large size, you know, it is more likely to be thrown around by wind and brush against things and then have blemishes and holes and so on. So overall, I just found the large leaves to be way too much of a space commitment, don't look that pristine and nice anymore, and they lose the key feature of having those beautiful silver splotches at the front. So not worth it. So what I did is I completely chopped it up and I'm now bonsaiing it in this small pot. Judging by the root system, I should repot this, but I will not repot this, because if I repot it and give it a larger pot, it is then likely to mature, which I don't want. So I'm gonna keep it in this pot, and if at some stage it is so root bound that it stops growing completely, I'll chop her up again and then I'll plant a few smaller cuttings back into this pot. But the goal is to just not exceed this. I think it's perfectly fine as it is. You don't always need it to be super, super large. I think this is just a really nice compact display, has lots of interest. There's three growth points in here at the moment, and I think this is the best it's ever looked, and I've had this plant for 4 or 5 years. And it only looks that good because I finally know what I'm aiming for. I'm aiming for a juvenile to teenage display. Even definitely more juvenile than teenage, to be honest, because I even think this leaf is already too large. I want leaves this size, like this size kind of. I like this. I think this is really cool. And that's really good news that this plant looks so good when juvenile, because it is just the craziest space commitment when mature. Oh my god, this looks so good. I love this plant. Alrighty, next up we've got my Philodendron L. Choco, or it's technically Philodendron rubri juvenile, aka L. Choco red. I've had this plant for 3 years and I think it looked amazing in year 2. When I bought this plant exactly 2 years ago, it looked like this. Honestly, the smallest little plant you could possibly buy. However, with the help of good growing conditions, consistent care, and 2 years of time, I managed to grow my Philodendron L. Choco red into this beautiful, beautiful specimen that it is right now. So anything between 12 months and 24 months, I think it looked pretty good. I've honestly had the easiest time sizing up this plant. I received it as the tiniest little tissue culture plant, and then over the last 3 years I have attempted in growing it to maturity, because that's usually what I do with my velvet philodendron. Now unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, see how we go, in year 3 of growing this plant, it has absolutely shed itself. And there's a full video on this plant and the issues I've had with this plant coming up very shortly, actually I think at the end of this month. But basically in year 3 I've had basically no growth, and all of the mature leaves slowly started dropping and I had to cut them off because they looked too ugly. So due to the lack of growth, I actually have no mature mother plant to show you anymore. This is the bottom part of the initial chop and extend. Has suffered severely through thrips over winter, so I'm now recovering it and regrowing it. But it's almost like a blessing in disguise, because I do think that the El Choco looks best when juvenile. It's called El Choco Red or rubri juvenile because it is red when juvenile. Have a look at this leaf down here. It is super, super dark and really nice and shiny, and that is because it has these red backs. Now these are not the best examples of the red backs because I think I grow it in too much light in my greenhouse. You can see it here, the red back. Let me see if I can maybe put some B-roll on screen for you to show you. I just don't have a nice plant to show you at the moment, but I'm working on a strategy. I don't think you want the leaf size to exceed this sort of size. I think the shape stays really nice. I thought it had some of the most beautiful heart-shaped leaves. But it loses the key feature, the red back, and as a result of losing the red back, it also loses that really dark color at the front. And I also think that with maturity, the velvet didn't look that good anymore. But maybe the velvet not looking that good anymore is more a result of the color rather than the actual texture. And on top of that, I just found it to be a really hard grower once it is mature. It just kept aborting leaf after leaf after leaf, which never happened to me when it was juvenile and it was growing in the same conditions, in the same medium and so on. So I find it to be much harder to grow and less rewarding to grow when mature. I think over here it's something where I would aim for volume. On that pole, you know, right now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 shoots on here. I would love all 4 shoots to grow substantially over the growing season out there. And then hopefully I have a really lush pole of lots and lots of small heart-shaped leaves with these beautiful red backs. That is my goal over here. The other thing that is really annoying with the mature plant is that it has, similar to the sodiroi, massive petioles. So there's leaves sticking in all directions and it just doesn't look that good anymore. So way too much of a space commitment, lost its key feature and way too hard to grow as a mature plant. So keep it juvenile. Very similar to that, as in I don't have a nice mother plant to show for anymore. This is my Epipremnum pennatum cebu blue. And I get this every time. People are like, it's not a cebu blue, it's not even blue. Yeah, that's because with maturity it unfortunately loses the blue. It could also be a Baltic blue or something like that. I'm not too sure. It was sold to me as a cebu blue and it looks like a cebu blue to me, but it is what it is. Now when juvenile, this plant was still really nice and blue, this sort of silver blue that you're after. And then as it matured, it became really, really green. This is quite a large plant. It is my Epipremnum pennatum cebu blue, but it has lost all of the cebu blue part. Now similar scenario to my El Choco. Ever since maturity, I'm having a really hard time growing this. This has not grown in 12 months. I'm not too sure why. It's growing in my garden and all the other plants are growing. Even the variegated Epipremnum is still growing out there. Just this one is not growing. Whereas to get it to maturity, it was one of the easiest journeys. It grew like a weed out in the garden. So I'm not too sure what went wrong, if it was a direct result of my chop and extend, if it was a result of doing the chop and extend going into winter. That was last winter already. I'm not too sure, but at the end of the day, it's not really growing for me anymore. Now, I do appreciate these large leaves. I do like them, and I like the fenestrations. They can look super, super nice, but I feel like there's a lot of leaves that look like that. At some stage, it almost looks like a bloody palm. You know what I mean? Whereas the cebu blue as a juvenile plant is a little more unique. It is not super common to have blue and silver tones in our plants, right? It's very common to have green. And I think juvenile plants are more blue and silver because it reflects the light more or something, or absorbs the light more or something like that. Basically optimizes the photosynthesis for small plants that should have less access to light. Whereas when the plant climbs, gets access to more light, it doesn't need that mechanism anymore. So I think that's the kind of biological reasoning behind it. I mean, it's all based on evolution, right? So there's always something. There's always a reason why. It's one of these plants that ideally I would like to grow one of each. I would like to grow a juvenile one, and then I think the mature one would be a nice statement piece in my garden. But unfortunately, it's not growing anymore. I think the perfect compromise is a teenage plant. In the teenage stage, it still has that nice blue, but it also starts having some fenestrations, and I think then the plant looks amazing. And to keep it juvenile, you could just not grow it up a support, right? The support signalizes to the plant, let's go, this is how we grow in nature, let's mature. So grow it as a trailing plant and will always stay juvenile. But if you want to grow it more like a teenager, you have to give it some level of support. Maybe just don't provide it with quite that much light. So it stays small leash, doesn't mature to its full potential, but oh my god, it just got really dark out there. What happened? It's like somebody turned the sun off. Sorry guys. I feel like it... Oh, and it's back on. So yeah, anyway. I think I've said enough. Alrighty, next up we've got my Monstera dubia, and I think Monstera dubia is the perfect example of enjoy the journey. I loved growing this plant. I received it as a really juvenile, unrooted 2-node cutting, and I popped it on a moss pole when it was really small. It actually looked ridiculous on this large pole, but it grew super fast, and I think within 18 months I managed to mature this plant quite nicely. And I loved that journey. It was kind of like, it was just so rewarding as a grower, so encouraging, right? Where it's like with every leaf the plant is getting larger, we're getting my first fenestrations, then we're getting more fenestrations, and suddenly these really large, super fenestrated leaves. And then I lost interest. First of all, I feel like it was taking up a lot of space and the pole was looking kind of empty. All the leaves were just left and right of the pole. And then I was just like, well, it takes up a lot of space. It requires a lot of light input to keep it mature, but it lost that sort of interesting journey. From now on, I know that every leaf that unfurls is just going to be a perpetuation of the same leaf over and over again. It didn't really tickle that ambition in me anymore. So yeah, so I kind of lost interest, and as a result of that, it took the back seat, aka, you know, it's not the priority plant that needs to get the best conditions, and eventually it didn't fit inside anymore, so I put it in the garden, and it has to suffer in the garden year round, which definitely hates winter. It doesn't fully die back, but it just goes dormant and is going through so much shock that it just takes so long to come back that by then we're back in winter. So it hasn't really grown for me over the last 2 years, and honestly, I'm not really mad. I'm actually in the process of growing a juvenile dubia again because I really enjoyed that shingling pattern and I enjoyed the journey. So apart from the growth journey becoming a little boring, I also think it looks nice when it shingles. It's a little different, right? Not many plants shingle, and not many plants transition from this shingling to this maturity. So I really enjoyed it when on one pole you can still see the juvenile shingling plant, then a more teenage plant, and then a mature leaf all in one pole. And it's a very interesting conversation piece with people that come and visit me as well, where I'm like, look at this plant and how it transforms. It's just so interesting. It also loses the beautiful silver that it has when it's juvenile. So I think juvenile to teenage is my preferred look of this plant. This is really the definition of there is no end result. You don't even want this end result. I think you definitely want to enjoy the journey. And this plant taught me a lot. It was one of the first plants to do chop and extends with, first plant to reach maturity and so on. So I'm really grateful for that plant, but now that I've been there, done that, and I've gained experience with other plants, I want to grow a juvenile version of this. Let me take this out because I think it's falling. I need to hook it back in my fence, and then I'll bring the last plant back inside. I am back. I am surrounded by Monstera, Siltepecana, El Salvador. This is the bottom part of this, and it's been a plant that has been with me for a long time. It was also one of my first plants I've ever had. One of my first plants I've ever grown up. A moss pole. One of the first plants that I've really had great success with. So it is an easy grower, and I really like it, and I prefer it over the regular Siltepecana as well. But I don't think maturity serves it that well. While I do kind of like these fenestrations that it grows when it's mature, it loses its key feature, the silver. This plant is not even juvenile. This plant is definitely more on the teenage side. But you can still see very distinct silver markings, some fenestrations, but nothing crazy. And it's just really lush. Over here, because I haven't really been aiming for maturity with this plant in a long time, I've just trailed it up and down for many times. So there's lots and lots of vines on here. Hence it's such a lush look. So I really like this, and it's grown in my garden year round as well, so it's quite hardy. Yeah, you can even see over here when it's, I don't know why it's kind of run away from its pole, but you can see it should be more silver. But now you don't have the light anymore. Here we go. It's more silver when it's juvenile. Over here, however, with maturity, it still has a little bit of the silver, but it is losing it more and more. I do love these fenestrations. I think they're kind of unique compared to a lot of other Monsteras. I just wish I could have these fenestrations with this level of silver, and then I would be really, really happy. The other thing I don't necessarily like about this plant when it's mature, it does have quite long petioles as well. So it can be a bit of a space commitment, especially if you want to grow it as a lush plant. Now I think out of all the plants I've shown you today, I'm the least upset about this plant maturing, because I do think it still retains a little bit of the silver compared to the dubia, for example, that completely lost the silver. The plowmanii is completely gonna lose the silver and so on. It kept a little bit of the silver, but maybe because I haven't maxed out the maturity just yet. Maybe if I'd grow it even larger, it would lose all of that as well. But it grew so fast, I gave up on chop and extending over here. I frequently just trail it up and down because I don't have time. And that is it. Those were 8 plants that I think look better juvenile than mature. Most of the reasoning really came down to them losing their key feature, right? Especially when a plant matures and takes up so much more space, it's got to deliver a lot of bang for the buck, right? Why would I commit literally dining table sized areas of my house for a plant that lost the very feature that I bought it for in the first place, like the El Choco red being red in the back, like the sodiroi having silver splotches, like the plowmanii having the nice little silver markings. Why would I commit all that space if the plant doesn't even deliver what I bought it for in the first place? And these features can either be the shape, the texture, or the color, or a combination of all of it. But at the end of the day, it's also still personal preference. Look, if I had all the space in the world, I would probably love to grow a mature and a juvenile version of each of those plants, because there's something nice in the mature plant as well. Of course, don't get me wrong, like a really nicely grown, healthy dubia that's actively growing can look really nice. But if I have to choose between one or the other, then for those 8 that I showed you today, I'd rather choose the juvenile version. Now, how do we achieve a more juvenile look? Well, we give it conditions that aren't optimized, because conditions are ultimately setting the potential for a plant. So the closer to nature, the more likely you'll get full maturity out of the plant. So that is somewhat easy to achieve indoors, right? Because we usually don't have tropical conditions indoors. Growing it against the growth pattern. So if you have a climber but you grow it as a trailing display, then the plant will not mature because you're not growing it in line with its natural growth habit. Bonsaiing the plant, giving it a pot that's technically too small so it can't expand its root system, is also a good way of keeping a plant small. That's how you create bonsais, right? Bonsais are actually trees. They have the same DNA as the large tree that's in our garden. It was just bonsaied by constantly trimming off leaves and branches and roots and keeping it in that teeny tiny pot where it doesn't have enough space to really expand and really realize the full potential. And lastly, frequent propagation. If you keep cutting the plant up, you introduce shock, and then the plant needs to re-establish a root system instead of continuously maturing. So those are all strategies you can use to keep your plant juvenile, and hopefully that will make the growing journey easier and more fun. Now, I have a few other plants that I could think of that look better when juvenile, so let me know if you're interested in a part 2, and help me out in the comment section down below as well. What is a plant that you have grown to maturity and then realized, that looked better when it was small? I'll read through all of your comments, and if I agree with some of your suggestions, they'll also make it into part 2. While you're down there, also make sure you give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. Bye!